is done here, when you send it to the President and get it signed and move ahead with a good reauthorization of the Federal Food and Drug Administration.
Under the previous order, the motion to concur with Amendment Number 2461 is withdrawn, and the question occurs on the motion to concur in the House Amendment to S3187. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Beckich. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts. Mr. Brown of Ohio. Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Conrad. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Dement. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heller. Mr. Hoven. Mrs. Hutchison. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Noe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Carey. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Mr. Cole. Mr. Kyle. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Lautenberg. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Lieberman. Mr. Lugar. Mr. Manchin. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson of Nebraska. Mr. Nelson of Florida. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen.
Aye.
Mr. Shelby. Ms. Snow. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Mr. Webb, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Hagan, Isaacson, Kyle, Shaheen, Webb, and Wicker. Mr. Burr voting in the negative. Mr. Nelson, Nebraska, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Leahy, aye. Mr. Rubio, aye. Mr. Brasso. Mr. Brasso, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Cardin, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Bingaman. Mr. Bingaman, aye. Mr. Carey, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Franken. Mr. Franken, aye. Mr. Brown of Ohio, aye. Mr. Lugar, aye. Mr. Sanders, no. Mr. Brown of Massachusetts, aye. Mr. Enzi, aye. Mr. Heller. Mr. Heller, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Pryor, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Lieberman.
Good afternoon.
Mr. Lieberman, aye. Mr. McConnell, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Inouye, aye. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Toomey, aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Ms. Mikulski. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Ms. Klobuchar. Aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Coburn, no. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Vitter, aye. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Lee, aye. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Dement. Mr. Dement, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Menendez, aye. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, aye. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Ms. Snow. Ms. Snow, aye. Mr. Grassley. Mr. Grassley, aye. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Risch. Mr. Risch, aye. Mr. Shelby, aye.
This will automatically, unless you do something different, automatically bump over to that motion proceeds
Mr. Baucus. Mr. Baucus, aye. Mr. Paul, no. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson of Florida, aye. Mr. Coons. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Kyle. Mr. Cole. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Akaka. Mr. Akaka, aye. Mrs. McCaskill, aye.
Now, the pending business after this is flood insurance.
Mrs. Hutchison, aye. Mr. Beckich, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Merkley, aye.
Paul voted no, right?
Mr. Carper.
Has he voted? Aye.
Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Lautenberg, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Rockefeller, aye. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Harkin? Aye. Mr. Conrad? Mr. Conrad? Aye. Yeah, Cole? Mr. Reed of Nevada? Aye. Mr. Chambliss? Aye.
Are there any senators wishing to vote or change their vote? If not on this, the ayes are 92, the nays are 4. The motion to concur. Motion to concur in the House amendment to accompany S3187 is agreed to.
Mr. President.
The Majority Leader.
Mr. President, I now move to proceed to calendar number 341, S2237.
The clerk will report.
Motion to proceed to calendar number 341 as 2237, a bill to provide a temporary income tax credit for increased payroll and extend bonus depreciation for an additional year and for other purposes.
Mr. President, I made a commitment to proceed to a 5-year flood insurance bill following the Farm Bill, and we've done that. It's the right thing to do. It's an extremely important piece of legislation. So that commitment I've lived up to. I had hoped that the broad support that we have for this extremely important bill will allow us to reach an agreement and finish the bill in a relatively short period of time. As everyone knows, the senior senator from Arkansas has had some issues with the bill. I have suggested that he have a vote, and from my talking to my Republican friends, they don't have a problem with that, to give him a vote. Unfortunately, as happens around here more often than I would like, we haven't been able to reach agreement because of a small group of Republicans are stopping us from doing this. So my options are really very limited at this stage. I can file cloture and put at risk our ability to complete action on student loans and the transportation bill, and that's what it would do. Because if I file cloture, we're going to have a cloture vote on this thing on Thursday. And I would have to file cloture twice because there's the bill and there's the substitute, which everybody agreed was the right thing to do to move forward on the substitute. That's 2 votes, at least 60 hours. The flood bill is a very, very important piece of legislation. It's not something we have to complete day after tomorrow, but it's something we have to complete a month from now. So I could file cloture and put at risk these important pieces of legislation, meaning the transportation bill, student loans, puts everything at risk. Or I can give supporters of this bill time to try to come to agreement on limiting the number of amendments. I really believe that the right thing to do is to give the people who want this bill passed, Democrats and Republicans, people who support this extremely important piece of legislation, a day or two to figure out if they can get something done. I hope they can. I really honestly do. So I'm not filing cloture on this bill tonight as I had really actually contemplated. And I hope that my Republican friends will work with us to get this bill done. It's, Mr. President, this is a bill that deals with flood insurance. I've spoken to a number of Republican senators, including Senator Vitter, who was the person that has spoken out on this more than anyone else. And he acknowledges that there may be a few amendments, relevant amendments, that we should have on this bill. I don't care. That's fine with me. Let's set up a list of amendments and finish this bill. So I hope we can get that done. I really do. This is, we shouldn't get in a legislative morass on a bill that is extremely important for the country, no matter what part of the country you live in. Dry deserts of Nevada, this is an important piece of legislation. The wetlands of Florida and Louisiana, a very important piece of legislation. So I hope we can get this done. Mr. President, let me just say another word or two. I'm really pleased to say that we're close to an agreement to prevent student loan rates from doubling for 7 million young men and women. That would happen at the end of this week. So I appreciate the leadership of President Obama. He's pushed forward on this for a long time. He's given many, many public statements in this regard. He's been talking to students around the country. He was in New Hampshire yesterday talking to students. They waited in the rain to hear him talk. And he's been working with leaders in Congress to ensure that students won't pay the extra $1,000 to get a degree. I would remind my colleagues that Republicans, including the Speaker, my friend, were willing to give up on this issue just a few weeks ago. We're not willing to give up on this issue, and I'm glad my Republican colleagues have agreed that we shouldn't give up on this issue. We don't want to let the rates double. Leader Cantor even said Republicans were done legislating. Remember that? But with the President's leadership and our persistence and with the help of my valiant Republican friends, we're going to be able, with a little bit of good luck, to protect 7 million students. And I hope that, in fact, is the case. I appreciate the diligent work of the chairman of our committee, Senator Harkin. Senator Jack Reed has been very, very hard on this, and other senators. And I'm leaving a few out, and I'm certainly not doing that intentionally. So I would hope that everyone understands the legislative issues we have to work toward the end of this week. I hope we can get it done. I hope we don't get trapped in one of these Senate procedural bogs where we're going to have to be here Friday, Saturday, and I hope we don't have to do that. There's no reason to. We can get all of our work done, but we do need a little bit of cooperation.
Mr. President.
The senator from Iowa.
Mr. President, I ask that my short comments here appear immediately after the vote on the final passage of the FDA bill and prior to the remarks just made by the distinguished majority leader.
Without objection.
Mr. President, today with final passage of the FDA Safety and Innovation Act and the reauthorization of the FDA user fee agreements, we have helped both the FDA and the biomedical industry ensure that they can get needed medical products to patients quickly. This legislation, now headed to the President for his signature, will ensure that the FDA can swiftly approve drugs and medical devices, save biomedical industry jobs, protect patient access to new therapies, and preserve America's global leadership in biomedical innovation. It will keep patients safer by modernizing the FDA's inspection process for foreign manufacturing facilities, while also improving access to new and innovative medicines and devices. It will reduce drug costs for consumers by speeding the approval of lower-cost generic drugs and help prevent and mitigate drug shortages. Finally, by improving the way FDA does business, increasing accountability and transparency, U.S. companies will be better able to innovate and compete in the global marketplace. Mr. President, with the FDA Safety and Innovation Act ready to be signed into law, we have taken an important step to improve American families' access to life-saving drugs and medical devices. As I have said throughout this debate, the bipartisan process that produced this excellent bill has been a shining example of what can be achieved when we all work together in good faith. I have worked very closely with my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, as well as industry stakeholders, patient groups, and consumer groups, to solicit ideas and improvements on the critical provisions in this bill. We have a better product thanks to everyone's input. Mr. President, my colleague, Ranking Member Enzi, deserves special recognition here. I want to extend my sincerest gratitude to him. Without his strong leadership and cooperation on this open, bipartisan process, we would not have the exceptional consensus measure we have today. So I want to thank Senator Enzi for his partnership and collaboration throughout the past almost year and a half. And I want to specifically thank the staff of Ranking Member Enzi, as they have devoted countless hours to working with my staff and others throughout this process to build consensus for this legislation. I want to thank Frank Macchiarola, Chuck Clapton, Keith Flanagan, Melissa Paff, Grace Stuntz, Katie Spangler, and Riley Swinehart. I sincerely thank them for their tireless efforts and loyal commitment to this cause. I also want to thank all of the Help Committee members, as well as other Senate members and their staff who were thoroughly engaged with this process from the beginning as part of the bipartisan working groups. Each has contributed significantly to this legislation, and I'm sincerely grateful for their contributions. I would also like to recognize Chairman Upton and Representative Waxman, as well as their staff, who worked tirelessly to reconcile the differences between the Senate and House bills. And of course, I want to thank my own staff on the Help Committee, who have spent many a night and weekend with Senator Enzi's staff, other members' offices, and our colleagues in the House, working to come to consensus on the critical policy issues in this legislation. I want to first of all thank our staff director, Pam Smith, and I especially want to note the tremendous work done by Janelle Krishnamurti through all of this last almost 15 months or more of pulling people together, working on weekends. How she does it and still have time for the twins is remarkable. But she does it and has just done it remarkably well, and I want to thank Janelle especially for her great leadership. Elizabeth Youngman, Bill McConaughey, Kathleen Laird, Dan Goldberg, Justine Sessions, Kate Frischman, Elizabeth Donovan, Frank Zhang, and Evan Griffiths, also on the majority staff on the Help Committee. And again, I want to thank our former staff director, Dan Smith, who left the committee as staff director just a couple of months ago, but he was very much involved in this until the time of his departure. And Mr. President, I also want to thank the Congressional Budget Office for their knowledgeable and capable team that was willing to work around the clock sometimes to estimate the budgetary effects of this legislation. Finally, we owe an enormous debt of gratitude to the staff members in the Legislative Counsel's Office, specifically Stacey Kern-Shearer and Kim Tambor. This bill is a result of tremendous efforts by their team to draft and redraft provisions in this measure, as well as address technical issues, often well into the nights and over weekends, and I thank them profusely for their dedication. This bill's final passage is a victory for the millions of Americans who need medicines or medical devices, a victory that would not have been possible without the dedicated work of our Senate family. Mr. President, with that, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Tennessee.
Mr. President, I'd like to congratulate Senator Harkin, Senator Enzi, their staffs, and all who've worked for 15 months on this important piece of legislation. I've watched the Senate for a long time, first as a staff member, more lately as a senator. And it's always been a little messy. It's always a little complicated. There are always disagreements. That's the purpose of the Senate, is to work out arguments. But over the last few months, this Senate has done a much better job of operating in the way the American people expect us to operate. We're all here to try to get results after we state our positions. And this bill especially affects the health and the safety of millions of Americans. Almost every American family is affected by the prescription drugs and the medical devices that we're talking about in this piece of legislation. So I'm glad to see this happen for two reasons. One, because of the result, and two, because of the way the Senate has worked, and it's a fine example of the way of what I hope to see happen more often. I also would like to thank the Majority Leader, Senator Reid, and the Minority Leader, Senator McConnell, for creating an environment in which we could have a large number of amendments, a lot of debate, a lot of discussion. That's what we're supposed to do. I think all of us appreciate that very much and want to create an environment where they can provide that kind of leadership. Mr. President, I'd like to ask consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
Thanks, Mr. President. Mr. President, earlier this week on Monday at the Library of Congress, there was a celebration, a 150-year celebration of the creation of land-grant universities. The National Academy of Sciences and the assemblage also took a moment to throw a bouquet to Andrew Carnegie for creating so many free public libraries. So, Mr. President, I'm on the floor of the Senate today to ask this question: just what was in the water in Washington, D.C. 150 years ago, in 1862 and 1863? During the 2 years after the telegraph dispatched the Pony Express in 1861, Congress and the President enacted the Morrill Act, creating land-grant colleges, authorized the Transcontinental Railway, reducing the time for getting from New York to San Francisco from 6 months to 6 days, as well as the National Academy of Sciences. They also enacted the Homestead Act. They agreed on a conscription law with teeth, a National Banking Act establishing a national currency, and a new Internal Revenue law, and they created the Department of Agriculture. And to top it off, at the end of 1863, on December 2nd, the last section of the Statue of Freedom was put in place on the top of the Capitol dome with a great celebration. Now, Mr. President, if I were the Republican national chairman, I might suggest that this transforming burst of governing was simply a matter of turning the government completely over to Republicans and sending home half the Democrats. By the end of the 37th Congress in 1863, Southern Democratic United States senators couldn't obstruct any of these laws because their states had seceded from the Union and they weren't allowed to vote. According to the Senate historian, that left 48 senators voting at the end of that session, 27 Republicans, 12 Democrats, and 9 Unionists, oppositionists, or senators who called themselves the Know-Nothings. Or perhaps, Mr. President, this burst of governing came because it was of the energy of a new political party, or the brilliance of a new president, Abraham Lincoln. Or maybe it was that Congress was simply more efficient in those days. The Morrill Act that created land-grant colleges passed both the Senate and the House in the same week in June of 1862. The President signed the bill into law 2 weeks later. The National Academy of Science was introduced on February 20th, 1863. It passed the Senate and the House and was signed by the President all on the same day, March the 3rd. Back in those days, the President would oblige the Senate by traveling down Pennsylvania Avenue on the last day of the session and sit in an office out here waiting for bills to be brought to him for signature. Maybe, Mr. President, it was another condition, the absence of 24-hour media and of special interest groups and of instant communication on the Internet. Or maybe it was that members of Congress had more time to think great thoughts while they were traveling to the session. It would take Senator Sam Houston 6 weeks to travel from his home in Texas to Washington, D.C. to occupy a Senate desk. No doubt it helped that there was a crisis, the Civil War. Americans have always risen to our best, it seems, in the midst of a crisis. And making the crisis worse, many thought the new president was incompetent. In January of 1863, a former Supreme Court Justice, Benjamin R. Curtis, reported, quote, general agreement on the utter incompetence of the president. He is shattered, dazed, and foolish, he said. This is from David Herbert Donald's book, Lincoln. The editor of the Cincinnati Commercial was more explicit. He wrote that President Lincoln was a, quote, awful, woeful ass. If Lincoln was not a damn fool, we could get along yet, unquote. The president, in turn, considered many of his generals incompetent. And he and Mrs. Lincoln were suffering personal crisis, grieving the death of their son, Willie. The war crisis clearly did help pass the transforming legislation in 1862 and 63. One impetus for the passage of the law creating the land-grant colleges was to provide military training. Among the first assignments for the National Academy of Sciences was to find some way to protect the hulls of the Union Navy from corrosion. General Grenville Dodge told President Lincoln that the Transcontinental Railway was a, quote, military necessity, even though Representative Justin Morrill, a visionary for some other things, said he saw no need for the railroad to go further than the silver mines in Nevada because it would be traveling through uninhabited territories. And the war caused the bickering Republicans who were remaining in Congress to pull together. The editor of the Chicago Tribune explained, quote, if we fail, then all is lost. Union, party, cause, freedom, and the abolition of slavery. Let us first get the ship out of the breakers and then court-martial the officers if they deserve it. So, Mr. President, it helped to have a crisis. But unfortunately, the formula for passage of transforming legislation 150 years ago is not so neatly explained as a crisis, plus a brilliant president, plus a high-minded Congress, efficiently enacting big ideas developed in Washington, D.C. The real story is much more American than that. As has usually been the case, these big ideas came from outside Washington, and they took a long time in coming. And enacting them into law was also a long and messy process. Jonathan Baldwin Turner's address before the Illinois Teachers Institute in 1850 proposed the creation of an industrial university 12 years before the enactment of the Morrill Act. Representative Morrill first introduced the idea in 1857. After much struggle, it passed in 1859, but President Buchanan vetoed it. 2 years later, Morrill succeeded. And even though the obstructionist Southerners were gone, Eastern and Western Republicans argued vigorously over land grants and where the new transcontinental railroad should go. The roots of the National Academy of Sciences can be traced to a group of Cambridge scientists meeting in the 1850s, or to philosophical organizations before that, or even all the way back to Benjamin Franklin. California entrepreneurs and spectators and politicians, some were all three, were the ones who persisted in the 1850s until in 1862 the Pacific Railroad Act became law. So the formula for success for these transforming laws 150 years ago was typically American. Big ideas bubbling up from around the country, plus entrepreneurial persistence, plus a crisis equaling transforming results. Now, how does that formula apply today to improving the American condition? Well, to begin with, we have a handy crisis. Washington is borrowing 40 cents of every dollar it spends. And by this rate, by 2025, that year, every penny of tax revenue will go from Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and interest on the national debt, with nothing left, unless we borrow more, for national defense, national laboratories, national parks, research, or education. And a second crisis, many fear, is that our country simply may be unable to compete with the emerging Asian economies. So what transforming steps should the United States take to meet these new challenges? My own view is that rather than creating new institutions, as America did in the 1850s and 60s, it would be much wiser for us to spend our time making the institutions we already have work. Let me discuss just two examples. First, our basic governmental institutions. The new Foreign Minister of Australia, Bob Carr, a great friend of the United States, said recently in Washington, D.C., that the United States is one budget deal away, he said, from reasserting its preeminence in the world. He means, of course, that the world is watching, actually hoping that at the end of the year the United States will demonstrate that we actually can govern ourselves by resolving the fiscal mess we have in a way that reforms taxes, controls spending, and reduces debt. To do this, Mr. President, we do not need a new government. We need for our newly elected president, whether his name be Romney or Obama, to lead. President Lyndon B. Johnson's press secretary, George Reedy, defined presidential leadership as number one, seeing an urgent need, number two, developing a strategy to meet that need, and number three, persuading at least half the people that you're right. And we don't need to change the rules of the United States Senate. We simply need a change in behavior. Less playing of games and more getting of results. The new Congress, next year's Congress, whether it be Republican or Democrat, must make its goal to dispute, amend, debate, vote upon the President's proposed agenda, and then to help the President succeed. Because if the President succeeds, whether he's Republican or Democrat, our country succeeds. We might well remember the words of that Chicago Tribune editorial writer in 1862 who said, "Let us first get the ship out of the breakers, then court-martial the officers if they deserve it." The second institutions we should refurbish and make work are our colleges and universities, all 6,000 of them, not just the land-grant universities that we celebrate this week. Again, we don't need new institutions. We just need to reassert the greatness of the ones we have. Our universities, along with our national laboratories, are our secret weapon for innovation. And innovation is our secret weapon for producing 25% of all the money in the world each year for just 5% of the world's population, we Americans. The list of what it would take to strengthen our colleges and universities is short, and it's mostly agreed upon. First, Stop sending home every year 17,000 of the 50,000 international students who graduate from U.S. universities with graduate degrees in advanced science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. Give them a green card and let them stay here and create jobs for Americans. Next, double funding for advanced research as the America Competes Act, which passed with huge bipartisan support in the Senate, has authorized. Third, repeal the federal Medicaid mandates that force states to spend money on Medicaid that otherwise would go to higher education. This has resulted in dramatic decreases in state support and increases in tuition to try to maintain quality in higher education. Next, while Congress is repealing the Medicaid mandates, it should literally cut in half the stack of regulations that hamper institutional autonomy and waste dollars that should be spent on students and research. And finally, Mr. President, the institutions themselves should look for ways to save money, such as full utilization of facilities during the summertime, such as 3-year degrees for some students, and reforms in teacher tenure. In the 1960s, Mitt Romney's father, George Romney, offered this advice to the big 3 Detroit automobile manufacturers. Mr. Romney said, quote, "Nothing is more vulnerable than entrenched success. Nothing is more vulnerable than entrenched success." The big 3 didn't pay attention, and you see what happened. It's good advice for universities today. Now, Mr. President, in conclusion, I'd like to say a word about the Carnegie libraries. My experience in life is that most ideas fail for lack of the idea, or to put it positively, that a great idea eventually carries itself into reality. Andrew Carnegie's great idea was building public libraries. All of us know of their importance. I remember that at the time the New York Times wrote an article about me, and they said Mr. Alexander grew up in a lower middle-class family at the edge of the Tennessee mountains. And I remember calling home later that week to talk with my mother, who was reading Thessalonians, gathering strength for what she said was a slur on the family. She said to me, "Son, we never thought of ourselves that way. You had a library card from the day you were 3, and you had a music lesson from the day you were 4. You had everything you needed that was important." Andrew Carnegie's gift and the federal laws 150 years ago creating land-grant universities and the Academy of Sciences and the Transcontinental Railroad and the Homestead Act all have this in common. They were not command and control federal government actions from Washington, D.C. They were big ideas that, when implemented, empowered Americans to do things for themselves, to travel, to own a home, to educate themselves, and to learn by using a library. For example, my empowered mother took me to the A.K. Harper Memorial Library in Maryville, Tennessee, when I was 3 years old in order to get my library card. Mrs. Alexander, the librarian, said to her, "We don't give library cards to 3-year-olds. "Well, you should," she said to them, and they did. So on this anniversary, for the congressional enactment of transforming and empowering ideas, there should be more hope than despair. We still have most of the great universities in the world in our country. They still attract most of the brightest students from everywhere, insourcing brainpower and creating wealth. According to a recent survey by the Harvard Business School of 10,000 of its alumni about U.S. competitiveness, if you're in business in this country, it's still hard to beat. America's entrepreneurial environment, proximity to customers, low level of corruption, access to skilled labor, safety for people and property, and protection of intellectual property. We have a remarkable system of government in our country created by geniuses that many countries struggle to emulate. So why should we not celebrate this anniversary by taking steps to ensure that 25 or 50 or 100 years from now, we have even more of the great universities in the world? And one more thing. Let me read exactly what Australia's Foreign Minister, Bob Carr, a friend of the United States, said in his speech in April. He said this: America could be one budget deal away in the context of economic recovery, one budget deal away from banishing the notion of American declinism. Think about that, Minister Carr said. One budget deal, an exercise of statesmanship up the road in the context of an economic bounce back. And all of a sudden, with energy independence crystallizing, with technological innovation, resurgence of American manufacturing, people who spoke about American decline could be revising their thesis. That is the Foreign Minister of Australia, our friend, talking to us, hoping that we get our act together at the end of the year and make that one budget deal. So, Mr. President, as we celebrate the transforming legislation of 150 years ago, why not take the advice of our friend from Australia? Why not take advantage of our opportunity at the end of this year to enact a budget that would reassert Americans' preeminence in the world? Thank you, Mr. President. I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from Arkansas.
Thank you, Mr. President. As the son of a master sergeant in the Air